So yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever it is you are in the world. Thank you for coming. My name's Richards, and I am going to be talking to you today about our SWORDv3 project, which is a deposit protocol. We have been going through a process to produce this third version of the specification for, well, it's quite a long time now, about 18 months, coming up in 2 years probably. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about SWORD and about what the third version of SWORD is all about, and why you should be interested in it, and what we've been doing over the last couple of years in getting us to this new version. Usually when I do presentations and I'm in the room with everyone, I ask for shows of hands to see who has heard of SWORD and, or who's looking for more information, which is kind of difficult to do in this format. So I'm going to kind of assume that you have heard of it, and I'm going to try and tell you as much as is feasible in the time that we've got. But of course, feel free to add questions to the Q&A in the chat, and we'll deal with them at the end. So let me give you a little bit of a history of the project. It's actually been around for quite a long time now. The first version of SWORD was released way back in 2008, and it was a first attempt to kind of standardize one of the key use cases that we have in the repository world, which is how do we get stuff into them. And so the first version of SWORD was very, very simple and focused around that specific use case, which we came to know as fire and forget. So you would bundle up your content, you'd throw it at the SWORD server, and you'd walk away. And after what happened to the content after that was down to the repository, and you had no further real interaction with it. And that was a good starter. It was built on AtomPub protocol, which was kind of relevant at the time and was kind of gaining some popularity for publishing or pushing content around the web. But it soon became quite apparent that for more advanced repository use cases and repository integrations, we were going to need a little bit more than fire and forget. So quite soon after we released the first version, we started to look into what a second version that had a broader treatment of CRUD, the create, retrieve, update, delete kind of life cycle that you would see on a kind of storage endpoint, if you like. So we started to look at the repository in terms of being able to provide storage and content management services for other scholarly systems. The most obvious use case that we really focused on back then was CRIS systems. So a lot of CRIS systems were wanting to do repository integrations, but they were managing all of the metadata through their front ends, and they were providing nice interfaces for their end users. So they were looking for a way to allow content from the CRIS to be synchronized to the repository, or to allow the repository to act as the kind of the file store and version of record for the content that they were displaying through the researcher-focused user interfaces that they were building. And so in 2011, we released version 2 of the specification, and that contained this kind of full set of content management capabilities. So you could make new objects, and then you could commit updates to those objects, and you could delete things from those objects. And that was done by a simple extension to version 1. So it all remained, the technology all remained the same, and it was just additional capabilities added to it. We then took a very long break, as you can see, 9 years in the intervening period. Actually, the work for SWORDv3 started in probably 2012, 2013, the very first ideas that we would probably want to do another revision, as people started to look into how repositories were going to work with research data. But for various reasons, that process moved very slowly. And indeed, we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on in the presentation. But eventually in 2018, we got some funding to look at how we can start to support the research data use cases that the community is now starting to face. And when we did that, at the very beginning, we thought, well, we're bringing the specification up to date for modern use cases. We ought really to bring it up to date with modern technology as well. And so the old version of SWORD, as I said, was built on AtomPub, and it was kind of REST, but it kind of played a little bit fast and loose with the REST principles. So we decided let's move to JSON LD actually specifically, and to really focus on being adherent to the principles of REST, and to build a protocol that was much more modern. So version 3, which is in its final release candidate now, does all of those things. And what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit more about what those things are and how they relate to what SWORDv3 used to do. So first of all, I just want to quickly give you some motivations for this. I'm not going to, by the way, I'm not going to get into technically what SWORDv3 actually looks like. I'm not going to show you any code snippets or anything like that. I don't think there's, time in this kind of presentation to do that. If anyone is interested, at the end, there's a lot of links to the specification and the code that we've written, and you can certainly go and explore that or come and talk to me about it afterwards. So I'm just going to focus here on the higher level kind of understanding as to what it is we're trying to achieve with SWORD. And so these are the kind of key use cases that we're interested in. Research data deposit is the primary driving factor here. That's what kicked off this whole third round of work. And then under that heading, we're looking at transmission of data, meeting good metadata standards. So it's not just about throwing arbitrary files around, it's about moving structured content with the metadata standards that we've come to expect in our community. It's about supporting machine-to-machine deposit. As research data becomes a thing, we might be looking for the machines that produce the data to being able to put that content straight into a SWORD-enabled repository. So we need to minimize the human involvement wherever possible. There were use cases around being a man-in-the-middle broker, so accepting content and then distributing that content to various other locations. Acting as real-time file storage, which is quite similar to the Chris use case that I talked about for SWORDv3. Being able to monitor workflow progress. What's the state of a thing inside the SWORD server? Do I need to take action? Is action being taken on it, etc.? And we also wanted to, as part of the research data deposit theme, be able to support arbitrarily large files. So no matter how big the thing you need to deposit, we want SWORD to be able to have the mechanics for you to deal with that. And also to be able to send files by reference. If you're storing files in specialist storage systems for the kind of data that you're working with, and maybe it's not appropriate to send that to the repository, we want to be able to put those in and either maintain a reference to them or dereference them as needed. So there's a link on the page here. The presentation is in the shed, so if you want to download it, I believe it's there. Otherwise, I can send it out if that's necessary. So you should be able to get at all these links in due course. So let me tell you what we did functionally to SWORDv3 in addition to what SWORDv2 already did to kind of support these use cases. One of the kind of first things we did was we added concurrency control, which is something that SWORDv2 didn't have. So by using the standard HTTP approach to concurrency control, which they call optimistic concurrency control, the idea is to avoid unintentional data overwrites, and that comes from the theory or the ethos that SWORDv3 will allow repeated actions on an object, so adding more data to it or modifying the data that's in it, and that may come from a variety of different sources. If you have a machine inserting data and a user inserting metadata, then you don't want those two depositors to clash or step on each other's toes. So concurrency controls gives us the ability to at least protect against unintentional data overwrites. We've also added a lot more support around metadata formats. SWORDv2 allowed you to do whatever you wanted with metadata, but it didn't give you the semantics to describe what you were doing. And so SWORDv3 now does that, so that you can move metadata around in a variety of formats, and you can explicitly declare what it is that you're doing. So you can confirm support with the servers that host the content. We've implemented segmented file upload, and it's implemented very similarly to how you would see it out in the wild. So we confirmed that our approach is pretty similar to, say, Amazon's approach to handling segmented file upload, and that means just being able to chunk large files into smaller chunks and then send them, and the mechanisms behind supporting that. And that supports the idea of multiplex as well. So if you've got several machines that you want to upload the content in parallel, then the segmented file upload mechanism can handle that. And then finally, some explicit support for by reference deposit. So those are the four main things that we added, and for the most part, they then give us the power we need to handle the research data use cases. So the differences then from SWORDv3, for those of you that are familiar with SWORDv3, we'll see are, first of all, it's JSON, not XML. And specifically, we're using JSON LD so that it sits nicely with the kind of semantic web or linked data community. We've made a lot of terminology changes, and SWORD has often fallen back to kind of banking analogies, deposits and statements and things like this. And we've decided to kind of dispense with all of those kind of analogies because they start to break down and they start to become confusing. So now it's a little bit more bland in its language, but we hope what that means is a little bit more easier to understand. We've also merged a few of the document types. This is one of the areas where SWORDv3 was really deviating from REST, is that it had a specific response format that you always got back, irrespective of what you'd done, and another document format that represented the type of the object. Those two things have been merged into one, so you can always see a consistent description of the object, and at the same time we then strictly adhere to the REST principles, so you only get that document back in the right context. We've merged the concepts of services and collections. Originally, SWORDv3 had this thing called a service document, which was your way into the SWORD endpoint of the repository. You'd hit for the service document, and that would then tell you what you could do. And one of the things it could tell you is that there are all these collections that you could deposit into. Those two different concepts have now gone, and there is simply the concept of a service, and a service may or may not be nested inside other services. So it simplifies the structure a little bit, and it gives a bit more consistency to how you interact with a service. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, we've got now a more formal metadata support. Version 2 of SWORD allowed you to put whatever metadata you wanted into an atom entry document, which is an XML document. In version 3, there's a typo on my slide. In version 3, you can put whatever metadata you want in whatever format. So if you've got it in XML, or you've got it in JSON, or you have it in some format of RDF, as long as the server tells you that it supports that format, then you can deposit content in that format. We've added concurrency control. We've added by reference deposit, as I previously mentioned. We've also added, after quite a lot of pressure, a native packaging format. So SWORD, I've always maintained that SWORD is a transport protocol. It is a transport protocol. And so we've tried to avoid saying too much about what content gets transferred over that protocol. You know, in the same way as you wouldn't expect HTTP to say too much about, or indeed anything at all, about what your HTML looks like. Nonetheless, as an integration protocol, the language with which the services talk to each other is important, but what it is that they're talking about is also important. And we have tried to restrain ourselves from saying too much about that. But in this version of the specification, we have identified a packaging format that is based on Bagit, that it has parity with the metadata formatting and the individual file transfer processes that SWORDv3 also implements. So there is a packaging format now that is kind of the SWORD standard packaging format, and it's as bland as we could make it, while also being feature complete. So now anything that you can do by individual operations over the REST endpoint can also be done by sending a package that contains the equivalent content. We have then implemented segmented file upload, as I said. And for those of you that really do know about SWORDv3, and I have no idea how many of you out there that will be, multi-part deposit has gone. There was a feature of SWORDv3 which allowed you to send both the metadata and file content in a single deposit. It was built on an AtomPub extension. That AtomPub extension was not particularly widely used, and the toolchain support for multi-part deposit was terrible. So I don't think we ever saw a successful implementation. So we've just dropped that concept. And the native package format that I mentioned above kind of does away with the need for any kind of complicated multi-part MIME messaging over HTTP there. So that's all gone. We've also added lots and lots of little things that were bugging us from the old versions of specification. Better use of redirects, better errors, more specific errors, and there's more of them, so you can be more accurate about what went wrong. Better semantics in general, and we've also removed content negotiation, which sounds bad, but actually in reality, content negotiation wasn't particularly widely used in the older versions of SWORD, and it added complexity to how the specification was implemented. So SWORDv3 doesn't have content negotiation as part of the specification, but it does have a mechanism by which you can discover content in a variety of different forms. So instead of negotiating for the metadata in one format or another, SWORDv3 simply allows the server to list the endpoints for the metadata that's available with its various properties, and then the client can choose which one of those to retrieve. So we're simply removing HTTP content negotiation, but not the content itself. And there's a short document there, SWORDv3 new features, on our GitHub that you can read, that'll go into each one of these changes in a little bit more detail. So what have we been doing then in terms of implementation? So everything that I just said there came from the work that we did on the specification, and that took place over a year in consultation with lots of people from the community, including people from the Samvera community. In October last year, we started an implementation project. What we wanted to do was make sure that we could implement the specification before telling anyone that the specification was complete. And we chose to do that in Python against Invenio, so the competition. And that was funded by NII in Japan. They gave us a pot of money to produce both the client and the server, at least in part because NII are Invenio users, and they have historically an interest in SWORD. They've been involved in the SWORD specification since the second version at least. So we may well see that in production in Japan at some point. So out of that work, we produced a number of kind of key things. First of all, we produced a common library in Python, one that understands all of the document types and all the various different semantics of SWORD more generally. Then we produced a client library, again in Python, and that wraps the common library and just provided you with all the kind of on-the-wire operations. So if you want to create a new object, there's a function for creating a new object, and it'll guide you through the process of sending the right data to the server. But the meat of the work was then in this Invenio reference implementation, and this, a basic SWORD implementation is not too difficult. Receive some content, put it in the repository, extract some metadata. The normal kind of repository fare. But what we really wanted to test was the more advanced features like segmented upload, which is quite difficult, and it involves various different kind of concurrency issues or race conditions that you have to deal with. When do you do certain operations? When do you do unpackaging operations if an object can still be edited by the user, etc., etc. So we spent quite a lot of time exploring what the complexities around implementing the more advanced research data features are, and we produced a server library for Invenio that can then be used to demonstrate the specification is implementable. It also produced quite a lot of feedback. As we went, we discovered these oddities, and we thought, well, this is complicated to do in a repository. Maybe we can change the specification in a way that makes this simpler to look at, or maybe we can add advice to the specification to help users decide how to implement against their repository. And in fact, and there's a link at the end of the presentation, in the end we produced a short document called Developer Considerations, which outline the kinds of things you need to look out for if you're implementing the server side of a SWORDv3 interface. So that feedback all came back into the project, and then we produced a final release candidate of the specification, which is currently out, and you're very welcome to read it and also give feedback. Technically speaking, we haven't made the final release of the spec yet, but unless anyone gives us any feedback, we expect to simply release the current release candidate as the final version of the spec. So then I want to talk to you, and the reason that we're here, I mean, it's very clear that we haven't done any Samvera work, and yet here we are at Samvera Connect telling you about this. This is because for us, what's next is to engage the repository communities more broadly. As a company at Cottage Labs, we've got engagement in a variety of the communities we work with Invenio and Samvera and with DSpace. And so we would like to see the Samvera community kind of getting engaged in SWORDv3. We've already had that in terms of the specification. We had Samvera community members giving us input on the specification itself, but we'd love to see an implementation in Samvera. So we're out here looking for support or interest in SWORDv3 in the Samvera software stack. And that could be kind of generally kind of central interest just because for Samvera, or anyone out there who has projects where SWORDv3 actually looks like that might be a fit for our project, and we're using Samvera either to come and talk to us or to get involved in SWORDv3 to help make it part of this community. So there's a couple of options we're kind of exploring in terms of funding. So either if there was a group of people within the Samvera community who were very interested in this and you wanted to do an implementation, then we'd be very excited about that, and we'd be able to talk to you and help you out with the implementation. Or if we can secure some funding, which is something we're trying to do, then it's possible that we'll be able to put together a team that can do an implementation for Samvera, and ideally a general client library in Ruby would be good. So we have some Samvera skill in house, but it would be good to involve other people in that project as well. So I kind of, in bold there on the screen, if you are interested in SWORDv3 or in any Samvera or related environment, then come and talk to us, and we'll see if there's something that we can achieve together. So that's on the technology front. There is also a community front to SWORD, it's quite challenging and it's quite interesting. And I haven't put too much emphasis on it in this presentation because my colleague Neil is in charge of this side of the project, and he's not here, and he's the guy who knows more than I do about this. But essentially, we're looking for a home for SWORDv3 in the longer term. It's sort of informally lived at Jisc since 2008, who are that Jisc infrastructure funder in the UK. And it's had a little bit of input from NII and a little bit of input from EBSCO. But it's not found itself like a true home. And one of the problems for SWORD in our communities, and the repository community more generally, is that we're really good at finding homes for software. We have great communities for looking after our software, but specifications have a less obvious place. So we've got a number of options that we're pursuing, and I can't really talk in detail about them yet because they're all quite in early stages, and we don't really have any concrete outcomes. But we are interested if anyone out there has an urge to, put their organization forward as a possible home for SWORDv3 as a specification rather than a piece of software. Or if you have an idea of someone that we could talk to, then we'd be very interested in that. And we hope that we'll be able to find a place for it so that it can, go on to SWORDv4 and SWORDv5 as needed by the changing requirements of our community and of our technology. So let me finish here by just giving you a long list of links, all of which you will be able to get hold of by downloading the presentation from the shed. There's obviously the specification. There is a document called behaviors, which is the specification but spelled out play by play everything that you might want to do with SWORD. So that's an implementer's guide essentially. There's the beginnings of a playbook. If you're looking to implement a particular use case with SWORD, we want to start filling this playbook up with strategies for doing that. So you've got a particular set of systems and a particular interaction you want. What's the right way to do that with SWORD? We have the developer considerations document, which I talked to you about earlier. And then we've got the client and the common library, both on PyPy and read the docs if you want to go and read about how the software itself works. And then the Invenio reference implementation is also on read the docs. And I haven't given you a link to the software, but you'll find it from the documentation. So there's plenty of resources, there's plenty to look at, and we would love to add a Samvera reference implementation and our Ruby client to this list of useful documentation. So please do come and talk to us and tell us, what you want out of SWORD and how we can help this community get that. And I will sign off there and ask you for questions.